Hi, this is Dr. Diane Gehart, and this is my lecture on Adlerian individual therapy that goes with my text, Theory and Treatment Planning and Counseling and Psychotherapy. Adler is often considered the unsung hero of psychotherapy and counseling because most people have heard quite a bit about Freud and also Jung, but Adler was also one of the original developers of a psychotherapy approach. But he's often the least spoken about. But what's really interesting, when you look at Adler's work, much of what he was doing over 100 years ago looks a lot like what we are doing today in contemporary work contexts. So even though he's talked about a little bit less, I think you're going to find that his ideas really are the most contemporary and fit the most with contemporary practices. And what's interesting is that many people don't go back and actually cite him, most likely because they didn't actually use his ideas when they developed their own approach. I'm guessing that's the reason why. I don't know exactly why other people don't talk so much about him. But when you look at the ideas that we're going to discuss related to Adler's developments, you'll see that many other therapeutic models, contemporary models, use his approach. So object relations, self-psychology, the humanistic approach, cognitive and behavioral approaches, the family systems, feminist, multicultural, and even postmodern approaches, and group counseling and education, you will see the roots of the ideas in these approaches in the Adlerian theory, which is one of the original counseling approaches. Adler was a contemporary of Freud and Jung, and depending on whose side of history you listen to, some describe Adler as a student of Freud, others will describe Adler as really having developed his ideas around the same time, that they were more colleagues. However you frame it, they definitely did work at the same time. Their ideas, they were in dialogue, their ideas definitely influenced one another, and yet there are really significant differences. So here's an overview of some of the key differences between Adler's work and his contemporaries, colleagues, Freud and Jung. The first is a holistic view. Much more so than Freud or Jung, Adler took a very holistic view to viewing the person not just as an individual or as a psyche, but also in context and in the person's social context, which is really a very contemporary way of looking at people, and yet Adler was really the first to do this. And so Adler really emphasized the social factor, the social environment, and how that influences personality. And again, in the context of working in multicultural contexts and working with clients from various cultural, ethnic, social, economic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, Adler, from the very beginning of his work, considered these social factors when trying to understand the individual. Adler also really emphasized that people have choices, and he did not see the past as determining the future. And so again, this very much distinguished him from some of his colleagues at the time. In terms of social motivation, this was also a really innovative concept of Adler's at the time, because he really believed that people were motivated by social connections, social interests, not just instinctual drives. And so he really saw that psychological health was defined by having social interest, a desire to be part of the community, and along with pro-social behavior, that this is really the key to being psychologically healthy. And so again, this kind of fits with some of the later attachment theories that have become actually increasingly popular over the years. That I did say increasingly popular over the years. So Adler also looked at humans as being very goal-oriented. He saw behavior as truly having a purpose, and that was to meet and achieve certain goals. Now, sometimes those goals maybe aren't the best informed or the best choices, but nonetheless, he saw all behavior, even dysfunctional behavior, as trying to meet some kind of goal for that person. And then finally, Adler really focused on and valued the subjective and phenomenological reality of the client. And so valuing that subjective reality as a truth to the person and how they're experiencing it. And we'll soon see in the chapters that follow that the humanists also share this emphasis of valuing the subjective and the phenomenological lived experience of the client, which is different than many other approaches. When you look at the Adlerian counseling process, you will also notice that it really distinguishes itself from both the ideas of Freud and Jung, and that Adler actually advocated for a very brief and present and future-focused counseling process. And it was also fairly directive, which is very unlike his contemporaries at the time. In addition, he saw the counselor's role as being primarily educational, helping the client understand. And so it's a much more active role than either Freud or Jung advocated for. The counselor also uses encouragement to help clients move towards goals. Again, this is very unique at the time that he practiced. In the actual process of counseling, Adler does address early recollections and memories, the family constellation, the family organization, a sibling position, and what he calls style of life, which I'll be defining in great detail. And overall, he saw humans as social creatures who strive to better themselves. And so that was kind of underlying all of his approach, was this view that humans are inherently social, and we do want to make ourselves better. And so there is this kind of positive view of human nature. One of the key concepts in Adlerian counseling is this idea of style of life, sometimes called the lifestyle. But Adler had a really unique definition of what this meant. He really saw it as a set of attitudes and assumptions that fundamentally shape the way a person sees life. So it's kind of the lens through which you interpret all your life events. And he believed that it did emerge in the first 6 years of life. So in this way, he is similar to some of his colleagues who saw those first early years as really defining the personality. Although this isn't technically a theory of personality, it's more of the cognitive set one has when looking at life. He also believed, however, that development and other events, including trauma, could shape one's style of life. And he saw problems or difficulties are basically evolve out of or come from faulty interpretations or mistaken notions that cause problems and difficulties. As you can imagine, between 0 and 6, it's pretty easy to develop some mistaken notions about life, such as life is always fair or life will always be unfair to me. Either one of those can emerge quite easily early in childhood. And so Adler always goes back, and a lot of the, especially the early interventions and assessment in this approach focus on trying to understand the person's fundamental style of life and those early errors that a person developed, due to various life circumstances. And so he calls these basic mistakes, these early assumptions about life that are basically faulty. And so he saw the whole process of counseling was simply to correct these basic mistakes, these incorrect assumptions about life, and thereby enabling a client to consciously choose a new style of life, to consciously choose how the client wants to go about leading his or her life. So closely related to the concept of style of life is this idea of social interest and community feeling. And basically, Adler defined health, psychological health, as having social interest and a strong sense of community feeling. And so this is this lived experience of having commonalities with others, being part of a community, and benefits of cooperating with others. And so there's really this sense too that a healthy person is willing to actually give more to the community than one actually receives in return. So it's a sense of even generosity. And so this is kind of the be-all, end-all goal in Adlerian therapy, is to develop a greater sense of social interest, because Adler really believed that psychologically healthy people, and ultimately most forms of dysfunction, result from not having healthy levels of social interest or feeling part of a community. Adler identified 3 areas of social life in which a person needs to develop this sense of social interest. The first is communal life, which is the sense of being part of a community. The next is work life, and that is somehow contributing to society, doing your part, and that may or may not look like a 40-hour-a-week job, but somehow contributing to others beyond yourself. And then finally, love relationships. So Adler also saw that romantic relationships, family relationships, parent-child relationships are also another area in which one needs to develop a sense of social interest. Now, modern Adlerians have added 3 more to this, the first being self-acceptance, the next being spirituality, and then finally parenting. And so a healthy adaptation in each of these realms involves striving for the goal of perfection in the sense of being the best person you can be. Where a poorly adjusted person, someone who's going to be having symptoms and problems, are striving for the goal of personal superiority, which means trying to be better than someone else. So you're not trying to be the best you can be, but when you slip into this idea of, I have to be better than someone else, then you're much more likely to have psychological difficulties from this view of Adlerian therapy. In addressing social interest, Adler discussed inferiority issues. And we've all heard of an inferiority complex, and Adler is one of the first to talk about this. It's where some of that phraseology comes from. But Adler identified 3 types of inferiority. The first 2 actually promoting social interest, and the final one inhibiting it. So biological inferiority is that painful realization that we need each other to survive. And so that when one has a sense of biological inferiority, one is much more likely to cooperate with groups because humans need to survive, or need to work together to survive. They always have. In some ways, we're much more like pack or herd animals than anything else. The next is cosmic inferiority, and that's recognizing death and limitations of human existence. And so this promotes social interest. So the more one is aware of existential issues, and also just being part of this larger cosmic whole, one is much more likely to actually work towards social values and to be a useful part and a contributing part of the broader human family, for lack of a better term. Then finally, there's personal inferiority, and that's a sense of feeling less powerful, less valued, less able than others, and a sense of not belonging to a community. And so this inhibits social interest. And so it's this area of personal inferiority that a lot of the Adlerian approach focuses on in helping people. And so you'll hear there'll be a focus on encouragement and empowerment, but helping people overcome this sense of being personally inferior, because that's going to make them much less likely to actually cooperate with others. Now, Adler sees us as having a couple of options in terms of how to respond to a sense of personal inferiority. The first is trying to gain a sense of significance through achievement. And so that describes folks who work really, really hard to have some kind of achievement, to say, okay, I am good enough in the world. And really, without their achievements, they don't feel good enough in the world. The other option, which is less ideal, is to avoid obligation, avoid risky decisions, and avoiding even connection with others. So in this sense, you just feel so unworthy, and so you're kind of avoiding life. Obviously, this is a less functional approach, and you're more likely to have more problems. But nonetheless, trying to gain significance and meaning in life but through achievement is also not really a recipe for happiness from an Adlerian perspective. So it's slightly more functional, because at least you're engaging with others, and there's a certain amount of trying to work within the community, but there's this deep down sense of still not being good enough, and I have to perform or I won't be good enough. And I think Adler correctly points out that that's really not the best recipe for happiness. So Adler sees the counselor's role is to encourage people to transform their sense of personal inferiority, not being good enough, and to instead promote a sense of social interest, and thereby kind of reducing this overall sense of not being good enough at a very fundamental core level. Adlerian counseling has 4 very distinct phases of the counseling process. In the first phase, the focus is really on establishing an egalitarian relationship. In the second phase, there's this assessment of the style of life and also one's private logic. Then in phase 3, there's an encouragement of insight and self-understanding, looking for the kind of basic mistakes in that style of life and private logic. And then finally in phase 4, the emphasis on education and reorientation. So in phase 1, there's this emphasis on establishing an egalitarian relationship, making a very positive and warm connection with clients. And there really is a focus on the strengths and abilities and helping clients find better ways of coping. And this whole relationship itself helps improve a person's sense of belonging and being good enough, and begins to help reducing the sense of overall inferiority. And also helps the client to become a more meaningful contributor to their community. And if you think about it, here's Adler, a contemporary of Freud, and he's advocating for an egalitarian relationship. And so this, again, it's another example of how in many ways Adler's approach certainly describes, kind of the norms of contemporary practice much better. So it really is kind of remarkable when you look back in history when he was working, and to promote such a stance, I think, is quite remarkable. Now, in the second phase, this is the basic assessment phase, and this is where he gets into the style of life and a person's private logic, and trying to understand the basic mistakes, the faulty assumptions about life that are really at the root of the presenting problem, whatever that might be, whether it's depression, anxiety, or relationship problem. And so the counselor looks at the family constellation, and specifically the sibling position, and the client's role within this family system. In addition, he looks at early recollections, believing that it's possible that these might help the counselor understand, where did some of these really early kind of incorrect ideas about how life works, where did these might come from? And so often he found that early recollections helped him identify these basic mistakes. And then also contemporary Adlerians have developed a DSM diagnosis approach that in linking it to basic practices in Adlerian counseling. So in phase 3, the counselor is going to help the client develop insight and self-understanding to help the client begin to correct these basic mistakes. So there's an emphasis on looking at the client's private logic, and to identify sources of positive motivation to take action and make changes. And in this phase, sometimes the counselor will offer possible interpretations. For example, looking at how feelings of inferiority might actually be related to instances in the client's life where they're avoiding commitment, whether it's in a love relationship or in a work situation. And so beginning to identify how some of these feelings of inferiority might actually be fueling their problems. And so again, though, the counselor's working with the client collaboratively to help the client find useful, meaningful interpretations of their own motivations and their own actions, and so that the client has a lot of buy-in. And this is quite distinct from especially more traditional psychodynamic and psychoanalytic approaches, where the counselor or therapist in those approaches really wasn't so much open to the client's buy-in, and the focus, especially in earlier approaches, was really that the analyst had the correct answer, and the idea was to bring the client around to see the therapist's perspective and insights, whereas Adlerian counseling advocates a much more collaborative process, as do many of the more modern psychodynamic therapists in this regard. So in the final phase, this is where the counselor helps the client to educate them and then take action. And so this is where the change really happens. And so in this phase, the counselors challenge clients to develop real-life changes based on these insights. And so the idea is to help the client reorient to life and develop a new style of life as they correct their mistaken beliefs about life. So in terms of the counseling relationship, Adlerians really have a unique approach to developing a counseling relationship. First of all, as we've mentioned before, the relationship is egalitarian. And so hopefully the counselors have a certain amount of social interest and they work through some issues of personal inferiority. So they don't see themselves as superior to their clients. And so they also want to help their clients maintain this sense of agency and choice. So even interpretation and psychoeducation are offered from a humble position, which is quite unique, I would say. And again, it really stands out to me as just remarkable that Adler used this approach so early on. Additionally, Adlerian counselors are quite encouraging, and they're very optimistic and hopeful about their clients. And so there's this true, deep in their heart, they see the best of their client. And there's this overall sense of encouragement. There's this fundamental belief that clients can change their lives in more meaningful ways. And so this is both expressed verbally and non-verbally. And this is done through facial expressions like smiling, listening attentively, really being present, taking action when needed, these sorts of things. Additionally, Adlerian counselors are empathetic and they role model social interest. And I love this quote, to see with the eyes of another, to hear with the ears of another, to feel with the heart of another. And so there's this real emphasis on being empathetic and getting into the client's worldview. We'll also see this theme picked up in the humanistic and existential therapists. In addition to this level of empathy and encouragement, there can be a directive quality to the counseling relationship in Adlerian work. And so in terms of directiveness, there's this real emphasis on providing very practical and helpful education and suggestion. Even though they are directive, they still try to be non-hierarchical and encouraging. And there's this overall sense of educating clients with a genuine sense of enthusiasm and hope that there are ways for the client to better their situation. The assessment process in Adlerian counseling basically focuses on assessing the client's style of life. And so there are several areas that the counselor considers, including the parenting style, their parents' parenting style, the family constellation and birth order, early recollections, the basic mistakes, private logic, organ inferiority or physical weak points, which we'll define, the question that addresses the function of the symptom, and then finally dream analysis. So one of the first areas of lifestyle assessment is assessing the client's parents' parenting style. And so especially looking for evidence of pampering or neglect. So some of the questions for assessing parenting style would be, just to have the client describe their relationship with their parents. Were they indulgent? Were they strict? Were they inconsistent? Or were they supported? How did the client get what they needed? How did you get what you wanted? What were your favorite strategies for getting your way as a kid? Did they work? Which client was able to influence the parents the most or the least? So just basically talking with clients to get their sense of their relationship with their parents and how their parents functioned, and to get a sense of whether or not there was pampering or neglect, because either situation is likely to create problems in terms of basic mistakes and some faulty assumptions about how life should actually work. Next, in the lifestyle assessment, the counselor considers the family constellation or birth order. So Adler considered birth order to be important, but not all determining. And so even though there's certain characteristics that are associated typically with being a first child or an only child, Adler did not believe that these really determined a person's characteristic, but he thought it was worth exploring and identifying where the person fit into the family system and what their role tended to be. Adler also believed that the sibling closest in age and also the most different in terms of personality was a sibling that most affects how one defines who he or she is. And so Adler would look at whether the client was the oldest, the second child, the middle child, the youngest, or an only child. And he would use this to consider and to reflect on whether some of the client's basic mistakes actually come from their particular role in the birth order. Another interesting area of the lifestyle assessment is this idea of assessing early recollections, asking clients for some of their earliest childhood memories, typically 3, to get a sense of how and what their basic mistakes might be. So a way to do this might be to ask, describe what you believe to be your earliest memory from when you were a child. What were your feelings at the time? What were others feeling? What did you understand or not understand about what was going on? What's the most vivid and important part of the memory? What really stands out? And what do you think you learned as a child from this experience? So not just identifying the memories, but also exploring what type of meanings the client has made from those early experiences. Again, this is just to be helpful in trying to understand the style of life, and not necessarily, these events are not necessarily determining who the person's personality, or not always directly related to the presenting problem, but they're certainly looked at as clues as to what might be going on and what might be some of the private logic or mistaken beliefs that are related to the presenting problem. So much of the meat of the lifestyle assessment comes down to identifying specific basic mistakes or faulty assumptions or errors in private logic. So, many of the assessment elements we've discussed up to this point their primary purpose is to help identify the basic mistakes. And there's so many different ways we can develop, basic mistakes and, mistaken assumptions about life. And most of us have several, often hitting all 5 of these typical patterns. So you have a lot to work with, generally with yourself and also with clients. So one of the most common types of basic mistakes is an overgeneralization. So that's exaggerating truths that are true in certain contexts to global all or nothing, truths. So all men are the same, or, one should always do this or never do this, these sorts of things. The second type of basic mistake is a false or impossible goals of security. This is always fun, trying to remove all risk from life, making unreasonable demands on others. We really often see this these really come to light often when you look at committed partnerships and marriages where, if you love me, you will never hurt me, you will never leave me, you will never say an unkind word to me. These sorts of demands are, as you might imagine, I hope I'm not bursting any bubbles here, but these are very unrealistic. And so sometimes these unrealistic expectations of how secure life could actually be is the source of a particular presenting problems. So another common type of basic mistake are misperceptions of life and demands, not understanding that there are inescapable rules and truths about life. Realizing that people do die, that survival takes quite a bit of effort, even in the modern world. And so, not actually understanding or fully taking these in can also create problems later in life. Another form of basic mistake problem is the minimization or denial of one's basic worth. So a really strong sense of personal inferiority. And that becomes problematic in relationships. So why would anyone want to love me? I'm inherently flawed, I'm not even good enough. So this kind of creates a very fatalistic and self-fulfilling prophecy that, as you can imagine, becomes a problem. And then finally, faulty values. And so these are basic mistakes in which one finds ways of coping with life, but these ultimately also become problematic. So believing that if I'm successful enough and achieve enough, people will have to love me. I will earn their love, earn their trust, or earn, my value, earn their respect, those sorts of ideas. And although these are sometimes gets one to be somewhat functional in various phases of life. They ultimately can create problems and also create a very heavy burden for the person, often emotionally. So these are some of the common themes that one might find in basic mistakes, and certainly this list is not exhaustive and can go on and on and on and on. Now, there are also several other areas of lifestyle assessment. One is what Adler calls organ inferiority, which certainly sounds awkward to modern ears. Maybe a more modern translation would be physical weak points. But these are either physical problems or disabilities that leads one to believe that they are physically inferior to others. And so again, this is going to be another source of a sense of personal inferiority that the counselor wants to take into consideration when considering the style of life. Another area of lifestyle assessment is dream analysis. And again, both Jung and Freud also did dream analysis, but each one of these gentlemen did it with very, very different goals in mind. And so in sense of Adler, dreams are really used as to provide insight into a client's inner process. And again, this theme should really be clear now as we move through this lifestyle assessment, is that dreams are again clues to help analyze the client's style of life and identify potential solutions. And Adler really believed that the meaning of dreams was specific to the client, and that the client really had the final determination in terms of the meaning of the dream. Finally, here we have the question, which is part of the assessment in Adlerian. And what's interesting is this: you can see that this is kind of a precursor to what solution-focused clients ask in terms of the miracle question. So it's just interesting to see this. This question has been around for a long time, so you may want to take note. The question is, in Adlerian counseling, what would be different if in your life if you didn't have this problem? And so the client's response provides clues as to what might be avoided by having the symptom. So this helps the counselor get a sense of, is there a real function or purpose to the symptom? And this is important to understand, because if there is, this needs to be addressed before the client's going to be willing to give up that symptom. So for example, if being depressed gets a lot of other people to do your chores or pick up slack for you, that may be a secondary kind of motivation for having the symptom. So also as part of the case conceptualization, Adlerian counselors look at a client's life tasks and their level of social interest in each of the 6 life tasks. The first is looking at work, and does the client feel like they're contributing meaningfully to society through education, through being a homemaker, child care, volunteer activities, employment. So any one of these can be a way in which a person feels fulfilled in this area. Looking at communal life and friendship. So does the client feel connected, and are they enjoying social connections? Looking at love relationships. So looking at levels of social interest, and this requires a lot of courage in our most intimate relationships. So exploring whether or not a client is feeling satisfied and able to demonstrate high levels of social interest in their intimate love and family relationships. Looking at self-acceptance, that it is foundational to really being successful in relating to others. Looking at spirituality, and it doesn't mean the client needs to have a formal religion, but having some kind of relationship to something greater than the client. And generally I require that this be the universe is either neutral or ideally positive, rather than the universe is out to get me, but some version of spirituality that supports the client and helps increase their sense of social interest. Finally, looking at parenting as a particular set of social skills and social functioning in which a client may need to function. So in treatment planning, you're going to look at specific goals can be written for each one of these areas. Typically, just 1 or 2 of these might be part of the presenting problem, but then maybe in the later phases of counseling, you'll address some of these other areas. So Adlerians, like most other contemporary mental health practitioners, are typically asked to do DSM diagnosis in their work environments. And so they have looked at how can you take the more traditional DSM approach and somehow find a way for it to meet the Adlerian approach. And so the traditional DSM approach is very pathology and deficit based, focusing on external measurable behaviors, which is unlike, as hopefully you may have guessed up to this point, is unlike Adlerian approaches, which really focus on the subjective experience that focuses on strengths and encouragement, positivity. And so what Adlerians have done is looked at how can we translate some of the traditional DSM language to this Adlerian work that we do. And so what they realized is that axis 1, which is where you would normally put the focus of clinical attention, a diagnosis of some kind, they call it the arrangement, so how the client has arranged symptoms to cope, and corresponding to clinical syndromes and diagnoses. And so this is considered the arrangement of symptoms, but they really see it as a client's way of trying to cope with whatever stressors they're experiencing in life. Now, axis 2 is typically a place where you would put personality disorders. And here, this kind of corresponds to, from an Adlerian perspective, what is called the style of life, which is that the very basic assumptions about how life works. Now, Adlerians aren't saying that everyone has a personality disorder, but instead that some of these kind of more pervasive, basic mistakes about life, which may correspond to a personality feature, that is described by the style of life can be equated to what would be put on axis 2. Axis 3 is where you would put the organ inferiority, but this in traditional diagnosis kind of corresponds to the physiological disorders that may be relevant to the psychological treatment. And so that organ inferiority kind of fits on this axis. Axis 4 is what they call the shock. Traditionally, it's where you put psychosocial stressors, but Adlerians were very attuned to the social world and social pressures and the client's social context and community context. And so various psychosocial stressors kind of correspond to that. And then finally, axis 5 is the barometer of life tasks. In most DSM diagnosis, this is a 100-point scale for global assessment of functioning, and the Adlerian assessment of life tasks corresponds to this. In Adlerian counseling, the theory posits some basic long-term goal, which is to develop social interests. So hopefully at this point in the lecture, you're not surprised. But basically, a social interest is considered normal adjustment, which means one has enough energy and courage to meet the problems and difficulties of life as they arise. So no matter what the presenting problem is, in the later phases of counseling, the emphasis will be on developing a sufficient level of social interest so that a person is able to cope with life, basically. More recently, in contemporary times, Adlerians have added concepts of wellness and positive psychology to the concept of social interest. And so the idea is to not just remediate weaknesses, but to develop real strengths. And again, wellness as opposed to health, where health can be defined as not being sick or ill in some way, not having significant problems, where wellness is more than that. It is a sense of well-being and feeling able to cope with life, and that life is a joyous, exciting discovery and adventure, which is a newer concept that has been emerging in the last couple of decades. So again, the goal here as it's evolved is developing not just social interest and social connection, but also empathy and a social consciousness, because all of these are correlated to happiness. So in terms of developing Adlerian goal statements, in the early phases you're going to be identifying and addressing crisis symptoms and or some other small achievable goals for the early phase. When you get to the working phase, again, you're going to be really focusing on reducing the presenting problem and reducing symptoms related to that problem. So this may involve increasing social interest and functioning in the areas and life tasks that are most closely related to the problem. And then finally, in the closing phases, you're going to be really focusing on wellness and increasing overall social interest in all areas of functioning. And so in this way you can see how the plan kind of starts with the presenting issues and then builds on that, ideally helping the client achieve a more long-lasting sense of wellness. Some example of early and middle phase goals in Adlerian counseling could be to reduce insecurities that lead to depressive thinking or jealousy in a relationship or even underfunctioning at work. It can also be to develop more realistic expectations of performance at work or more realistic expectations in one's marriage or partnership. Also, it could be something like reducing the tendency to overgeneralize that leads to arguments with spouse. Increasing ability to take risks in relationships to increase sense of intimacy. So, also reducing the tendency to calculate self-worth based on work performance. So any of these can be goals that would work from an Adlerian perspective. In terms of some of the late phase goals, again here you're addressing larger issues of wellness and functioning in all areas of life. So it could be something like increase intimacy and connection with family of origin or with friends and local community, increase sense of connection to the divine by reconnecting with a spiritual practice, increase self-acceptance related to sexual orientation, increase emotional connection, and redefine relationships with adult children, take steps to pursue a line of work or volunteering that is personally satisfying. So there are lots of areas in which one can focus on for the later phases of therapy. Now, one of the most basic and commonly used interventions in Adlerian counseling is psychoeducation. And in fact, psychoeducation looks quite different across the 4 phases of the counseling process. So in the first phase, the topics of education is helping the client understand the counseling relationship and the counseling process. So that may include describing the client's roles and rights in the process, including goal setting and deciding what to discuss in counseling. And so explaining how Adlerian counseling would address the presenting problem and how it works, and also defining social interest and its role in the client's problem. So as you can imagine, psychoeducation can be very useful here in helping clients set up realistic expectations for what they're going to get out of the process. Now in phase 2 for psychoeducation, if you remember, phase 2 is the assessment phase. And it's real important for providing a rationale for this actual assessment process. If you remember, they go back and they ask for early recollections and parenting style and things that some people may say, hey, I came here to help you with a problem at work or in my current relationship, and why in the world are we going back to the past? All that's behind me, it's not an issue right now. They might say my parents are dead, or God knows what. And so it can really help to explain to clients why you are asking these questions, so that they can be more cooperative and actually get something out of the process. So in phase 3, that's the phase, as you probably remember, hopefully, is where you're working on encouraging insight and self-understanding. And so in this phase, psychoeducation may take the form of offering information and or even research results that help counter inaccurate or unrealistic assumptions about private logic that may be fueling the problem. And so providing some kind of explanation of the style of life and psychological processes that Adlerian is based on can also be helpful in this process of helping clients begin to identify and recognize that some of their assumptions about life are very unrealistic. And then finally, in the last phase here, the phase of education reorientation, you probably would expect to be doing a lot of psychoed education. And so this is where you're using either research or theoretically based information to motivate clients to take new action related to a specific problem. And so this can also take the form of offering specific instructions or suggestions on how to best approach changing behaviors or habits of thoughts. And so again, in phase 4, there is a real emphasis on psychoeducation to help clients motivating clients to take action and also figuring out what the best action to take is. It may seem like offering psychoeducation is a pretty simple, straightforward thing to do, but I've actually found it's actually a very hard thing to do well. And I would say the primary mistake most people make is giving way too much information, far more than a client can make useful, practical sense of. And so the real trick is to give a little bit of information and then to really flesh out how the client can implement these with micro steps for the real world. And so it's one of the few interventions that I actually recommend you practice on your friends and loved ones, because often another common error is, especially for those early in their careers, is to use way too much technical jargon and technical terms. And so by practicing on real people who are not in the field, it will help remind you that you need to use different language when discussing these concepts with clients, so that clients can follow you. And my general principle is, if at all possible, I don't use a technical term and try to translate everything into common everyday language, rather than trying to get clients to memorize my language. So that's the first thing. Practice. Use words that are not technical whenever possible. Then the next thing is always to ask, and before you go into that, to just ask the client, would they like to know more about X? Would they be open to learning about, Y? And just by asking helps put them into a much more receptive frame of mind rather than just launching into it. Keep it brief, literally a minute or two. It's very rare, extremely rare, that I would even go up to 5 minutes. There might be a few times in my career I've done that, but I try to avoid it. And so I try to be quiet. Just make one point. Try not to go into a whole lecture for every single parenting technique possible. Focus on exactly one. We're going to work on natural consequences. And here's the principle of natural consequences. Whenever, a child has done something that is maybe, let's just say, the parent doesn't want the child to have done, to look for natural consequences. And I always tell, if you can't find a lot of natural consequences, then you may be forcing your own, whims on your client, on your child. So you may want to think about that if you're not identifying a lot of natural consequences. But you want to keep it really brief, and you're not going to launch into 4 other parenting techniques if you're going to just talk about one today, and you'll always have another meeting to go into more. Where we tend to get into trouble is we get on a roll and we're going to add 2 or 3, 4, 5 other parenting principles, and the client will probably shake their head and enjoy it. They like it. But the truth is, they're probably not going to go home and do anything useful with it over the week. The clients who can do that have probably bought a self-help book, and they didn't come to see you. So most of the people who actually come in, you need to keep it brief because you need to break it down to smaller steps. Then you want to make sure the client understands it and it makes sense, it seems to fit for them. And then you want to try to apply it immediately by breaking it down into step-by-step tasks. So the remaining 48 minutes of the session should go into how, when, where, and what over the next week is the client going to find ways to implement whatever piece of information this was. And then the next session you want to follow up and ask if the information was used and to what extent, if it worked, if it didn't, do we need to tweak it, and go on from there. And you really want to do that follow-up to see if the client even uses it or truly benefits. A lot of us enjoy hearing psychoeducational information. It's very interesting. But if the client's not going to use it, then you probably need to be looking at either doing it differently, helping motivate them more, and or finding another way of working with them because you're not on task then. Is homework, tasks to be completed between sessions, things that clients are assigned to do based on conversations about what's working, what needs to change. So it may be calling an estranged relative, going on a date with your wife, developing a list of things you're afraid of that hold you back. So it's anything that kind of emerges from the conversation about what a client can practically do between now and the next session. And this is especially emphasized in the 4th phase of the counseling process. So another type of intervention is called the interpretation of symptoms, and this is identifying the purpose of the symptom and its role in the client's style of life. So a common one is procrastination as a way of avoiding taking risks and possibly failing. And so there's a real purpose. The interpretation of the symptoms should really focus on the goal or purpose of the behavior and avoid globally labeling the person as lazy or fearful or lacking drive. So the idea is to see the symptom and look below it to see what purpose does it serve in the client's life. And these interpretations are very tentatively offered so that the client is able to correct it, revise it, rephrase it in a way that really fits better for them, so that they don't feel like the counselor is just judging them in some way. And again, this is most closely associated with the third phase of the counseling process. And so another element of this interpretation of symptoms is really being open to revisions and emphasizing strengths whenever you can. So the overall tone of the interpretation should be encouraging, highlighting potential strengths, possibilities, hope, resilience. So even saying something along the lines of, so in some ways the procrastination has served to create a sense of safety for you, but it seems that you may not need this as much as you did in the past. So even something along those lines is quite an encouraging way to interpret the purpose of a symptom. Another type of intervention or area of intervention are looking at the client's self-concept statements. So helping clients explore comparison processes that make it more useful and fair and accurate for how they look at themselves. So one type of self-concept statement is an inferiority-based self-statement, where the client's self-concept falls short of his or her personal self-ideals. So I'm stupid, I am worthless. And this is compared with an inadequacy-based self-statement, where the client self-concept falls short of what the client believes is the worldview or cultural values about who he or she should be. So I'm incompetent, I'm a fool, I'm a loser. So all of these are kind of comparison-based ideas of inadequacy. There's so many ways to feel not good enough. It's great. The last is guilt-based self-assessments, which is the client's self-concept falls short of some kind of ethical or moral belief. I'm bad or evil or unforgivable. And so this set of different ways of looking at and categorizing self-concept statements can help counselors think about what's going on for the client and how best to help counter those. Some other commonly used interventions in Adlerian counseling include challenging or reframing basic mistakes in private logic. So directly challenging faulty assumptions, reframing beliefs so that they are more useful to the client. And so again, this is done in a somewhat tentative way, not in a harsh, challenging way. But challenging the idea that it seems like you're living your life as though you have to always have achievements and more achievements and better achievements to be good enough. At what point have you achieved enough that you can stop doing that? Something like this is a very gentle kind of way to challenge. I'm also looking at natural and logical consequences. This is most commonly used with children and to help encourage children to make better decisions. But it also can even be very useful with adults who sometimes need to be reminded of natural and logical consequences. For example, teasing people in such a way that you actually are insulting them. The natural logical consequence for that in an intimate or long-term relationship is that eventually that does become a sore point in the relationship. And so pointing out these sorts of things can be helpful even with adults. Finally, the anti-suggestion is a type of paradoxical technique that actually discourages change and or encourages the symptom. And this is a type of paradoxical technique that we'll see used in other more contemporary approaches. And the most classic example of how to use this would be for someone who claims they can't control their worrying. The anti-suggestion can be used to say something like, so I want you to spend 10 minutes every single morning. I want you to time yourself, and I want you to worry for those 10 minutes. And that experience of kind of focused Choosing to consciously engage in a symptom often gives people a greater sense of control over it, insight into it, and enables them to handle the situation differently. And finally, perhaps one of the most fun named interventions is spitting in the soup, which refers to making the covert overt and emphasizing the covert benefits and the hidden power of having a symptom. And so this may sound something like, one benefit of depression is that you've gotten everyone else in your family to pay more attention to you. Or you must have reached near rock star status to have everyone in the subway looking at you. So these sorts of comments are obviously used very carefully, well-timed, with clients that you have sufficient how and this is used in a way to help clients, become more aware of how these symptoms may actually have some kind of benefit, which may be part of the reason why they don't want to let go of them. So in terms of the overall evidence base for Adlerian counseling, there's actually limited research on the general efficacy of this specific approach, although it clearly embodies many principles that are associated with common factors research. However, in particular, there's one very promising evidence-based approach, the STEP parenting program. And this is a parenting program that's been developed and around for years. It's recognized by the National Institutes of Mental Health as a promising evidence-based approach, which really emphasizes using encouragement to motivate children rather than classic behaviorism, punishment, and rewards. And it really emphasizes the importance of encouraging social interest and cooperative behaviors in children. So this is a specific parenting program that embodies many of the Adlerian and puts into use many of the Adlerian principles. In terms of working with diverse populations, Adlerian has a very respectable history, especially given how long it's been around. Arguably, Adler was one of the first feminist and culturally sensitive counselors. He really espoused feminist values, which again is pretty remarkable for the time in which he worked. And the whole just basic concept of community interest really speaks to these values. And so there are many concepts within Adlerian that facilitate work with diverse populations. First is the concept of social interest, that we are all social beings. We need each other to survive. And so that emphasis on social interest and developing social interest in all aspects of life, certainly supports the work with diverse populations. There's also this sense that when one feels superior to someone else, this is viewed as inherently a maladjustment from an Adlerian perspective. And so also this emphasis from Adlerians on focusing on social factors when assessing mental health issues, not seeing all problems within the individual, but also related to their social context. Again, this is very much in the spirit of working from a multicultural perspective. So very much at the heart of Adlerian are many principles and concepts that enable counselors to effectively work with a wide range of cultural populations. So this was a somewhat brief overview and introduction to Adlerian counseling. I hope you found it helpful, and you can find more details and specific examples of treatment plans and case studies in the textbook, and I wish you the best.